Folks, please say hello to Chris Barrett. Hello there, Chris.
Hi, Alistair. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, and thank you very much for that. And yeah, coming through loud and clear. Now, this is the second time you've been on. You were on last Christmas at our telethon. We're not having a telethon this year for various reasons, but so glad that you could come back on. Now, last time we were on, we spoke about an attack that had been made on Lord Nelson regarding the claim that he supported slavery. And you looked into that in your capacity as Vice Chairman of the Nelson Society, yourself and your colleagues. And I know that the story has developed since then. And so I was wondering if you'd just maybe like to start with why is Nelson in this statue debate at all? Maybe perhaps recapping just what's happened in the press and those sorts of things. Just like to take that away, please, Chris.
Sure. The situation, Alistair, is that obviously Lord Nelson died in 1805, 217 years ago, and for 212, 213 of those years, there was never any suggestion that Nelson was involved in slavery or the slave trade or had any interest in it. The reason he is such an iconic figure is because of the battles that he fought in the Napoleonic Wars and the wars with the French. And that's why we have statues to him, streets named after him, places named after him. But about 5 years ago, a Guardian journalist, Afua Hirsch, wrote an article that accused Nelson of being a white supremacist, a racist, and in using his position, both as an admiral and as a member of the House of Lords, to, and I'll quote this, it's to perpetuate the serial rape and tyranny of the slave trade. So you can imagine that the Nelson Society, who were trying to put forward Nelson's achievements, as you so accurately described at the top of this, we were slightly horrified. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of books written about Nelson, and that charge has never been levelled against him. Now, it seems to me that those are heavyweight charges, whichever age you live in, the perpetuating serial rape and tyranny and exploitation. So that was quite difficult for us to assimilate, to be quite honest. So I was charged with looking into this matter, and we wondered where the source of this thought came from. Now, I'll take you back a little bit of a recap on last year. You may recall, and I'm going to take you back actually to June 1805. Nelson is actually sitting in his cabin on HMS Victory. He's chasing the French across the Atlantic and to the Caribbean, trying to bring them to battle. As you know, we're back at war with the French, and Nelson was very keen to engage the French and destroy their navy. He chased them across the Atlantic, and he's pursuing them, but he hasn't quite caught them. On June the 10th, 1805, he's sitting in his cabin off Martinique, and he writes to a long-standing acquaintance in Jamaica, Mr. Simon Taylor. And we'll hear more of him, but he effectively was a very wealthy slave and plantation owner.
Right.
And the letter was a private letter between Nelson and someone that he had met maybe 30 odd years before when he was serving in the West Indies. It was not for public consumption. And you may recall that Nelson had a way of dealing with those letters that he'd written to acquaintances privately. And that was to produce what were known as pressed letters. Now, this is an early form of photocopying.
All right. Yeah.
He would write a letter, and then he would place it on damp tissue paper, and then turn it over, and then place the tissue paper on a clean piece of paper, effectively giving us an early form of photocopying.
Goodness sake, yeah.
Yeah, so, but it was quite high technology for 1805.
It certainly was.
Yes. Now, if I can, I would just like to quote a little bit from the letter.
Mm-hmm.
In the letter, he says, "I ever have been and shall die a firm friend of our present colonial system.
Mm-hmm.
I was bred, as you know, in the good old school and taught to appreciate the value of our West India possessions, and neither in the field or the Senate shall their just rights be infringed while I have an arm to fight in their defence," and this is the bit that's really interesting, "or a tongue to launch my voice against the damnable, cruel doctrine of Wilberforce and his hypocritical allies." Now, that has really been the source of discussion, I think, amongst academics.
Right. So
Why would he?
that's the letter that people are saying that he apparently wrote.
Yes. The,
Hmm.
well, in fact, that's actually a quote, and I'll come on to this. That's actually what Nelson actually wrote.
Okay.
But what I would say is we that's just been taken at face value by historians, and they've all said, "Oh, he was clearly racist. He was anti-abolition and was pro-slavery." And on the face of it, it perhaps seems that sort of way. But that struck us as being very odd because Nelson's actions, his relationship with people was one of great humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no public pronouncements along those lines anywhere. So that letter seemed very much at odds with what we knew and thought about Nelson, and in fact, what people have known and thought about him over 200 years. So it was clearly worth some investigation.
Yes.
Now, remember the date of the letter, June 1805. That was just 5 months before Nelson died for his country at Trafalgar. Okay, we can just roll forward a bit now, Alistair, to 2000 and some 213 years to 2018.
Yes.
A purported copy of Nelson's letter passed across the desk of someone called Martin Downer, who's a very eminent and leading specialist in Nelson artifacts. It was put aside as being a bit of a curiosity because the letter was clearly not in Nelson's handwriting. You remember Nelson lost his arm in
Right. Mm-hmm.
1797.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So his initial copperplate handwriting was totally transformed with his left hand to, I think, something that my granddaughter described when she saw it in Portsmouth recently, so saying, to put it bluntly, Nelson's handwriting wasn't very good.
Yes.
So there's a significant change. So this letter, written in beautiful copperplate handwriting, was clearly not by Nelson. And for reasons I'll explain, it couldn't have been made by his secretary either, because at the time the letter was written, his secretary had been killed at Trafalgar. Okay. This
Mm-hmm.
letter was written after Nelson's death, and it purported to copy his original.
Right. So somebody was trying to pass it off as a copy of the original. Well, that's a bit iffy.
It was what we would call in these days a forgery.
Yes.
They took his original letter, they wrote it out again, but they made some very subtle but very clear alterations, some 25 alterations to that original letter.
That's a bit cheeky.
Yeah. And why would you do that? Well, it's very interesting. You were talking about, was it John Newton just before?
Yes.
The dates are quite significant. This letter was published by William Cobbett in something called the Political Register in February 1807. Its purpose was to influence the debate on the abolition of the slave trade, which took place in February 1807. And why would the planters do that? Well, clearly Nelson had this astonishing and burgeoning reputation. He was the idol of the nation, and posthumously, he became semi-godlike.
Oh, yeah.
So the planters were keen to use his words in support of their case.
Right.
And they, by circulating this letter, not the original, they were able to suggest that Nelson was pro-slavery and pro-slave trade. So that was
and back in those days that they thought that was a good thing, that would somehow help to convince the establishment that, oh yeah, just keep on with this slavery and forget this trying to abolish slavery and the trade of it business, because that's that's not the right thing. Yeah, I get you.
Put bluntly, if Nelson thought it was a good thing, it must have been a good thing, because he's now a godlike character.
Yes, yes.
So that was really quite interesting. But we then discovered that in the mid 19th century, other versions of this letter were published, and that led us to think, well, hang about. I think we actually found 5 or 6 different variations of the letter. So we were then thinking, which one of these truly reflects the original?
Of course.
And of course, the only way we could determine that was to see the original. That original letter has never surfaced, and my belief is that the planters who forged Nelson's original letter eventually destroyed it, because had the original come to light, the scope of their crime, for want of a better term, would have been discovered.
Yes, that makes sense.
So we then came across a reference to, remember I was talking about the pressed letter, the photocopy letter, Nelson's private collection, that actually ended up in the British Library. And we actually found a reference to it in a very important biography by Dr. John Sugden, in sort of a little footnote in the sort of 600-page book, which suggested it was in the British Library. Frustratingly, that discovery came during COVID. So here we are, desperate to see the original so that we can compare it with all of the other versions, but we're having to sit on our hands. So that was quite infuriating. However, late in 2020, we were able to look at that copy, and we found, as I've said, a number of changes to Nelson's letter. So we concluded that the first letter, the first copy letter, the beautiful hand-written letter, was actually a forgery. We then thought, well, hold on. Historians are taking forged versions of the letter that don't vary significantly in some areas, but they're drawing all their conclusions about Nelson's character from those forgeries. And any historian who researched this could find 4 or 5 public versions of this forged letter and would have noticed that there were differences. So I raised the question, why didn't they try to explain why these letters were different? Why just accept what they say? So that's really where we got to. And so we started to analyse the letter, and we came to the very, very clear conclusion that there was very little to support the contentions that Nelson was racist, that he supported slavery or supported the slave trade. We do have to remember. Sorry.
Good. I'm glad you did that particular research and setting the record straight, as it were. So, what's the situation at the moment as far as that is concerned?
Right. Well, you and your viewers are amongst the first to know this. We've actually turned up a second handwritten forgery based on the original letter, and it then was very clear to us that the planters were very strong in the way that they were defending the slave trade and slavery, and they were using forged copies of Nelson's letter. They were investing a huge amount of money in leaflets and pamphlets trying to persuade the politicians. They were very well organized, but these letters were in circulation, being sent, I think, to members of parliament to try and persuade them that Nelson would have supported the slave trade. And so we've got that second discovery.
Right.
There's also a further little discovery, which I'm hoping all will be revealed in a book on this in the new year. We also think that the king, or as he was then, the Duke of Clarence, the future King William IV, we believe that he was allied with the planters and was feeding them information, and maybe even feeding Nelson's letters to him back to them to use.
Crikey.
So, and now I'm probably going to go to the Tower for this because that's now a royal conspiracy. So please stick with me.
Yeah.
Um,
It's not
so
doing his reputation much good.
no, and yet he was quite a compassionate man in many other respects. But it was,
Mm.
he was very pro-slavery. He spoke in the House of Lords in favour of it.
Yes, I think that's been fairly well known,
Yeah,
really. Mm.
yeah. So the conclusion we reached is that the planters were well organised. They took Nelson's letter, forged it to use it to their own ends, and so that's really where we are in terms of what we know.
Good, good. Well, I mean, it gets all around because here in Glasgow we had a so-called audit, which was commissioned by the the council, which is run by the SNP, and it was to look into every single street name and place and house in Glasgow, and how it related to. Now, this is the thing, not just how it related to slavery, which is one thing, but how it related to like the British Empire in general, and or what they call imperialism and colonialism. And that's kind of irritated me because slavery is a different thing from the British Empire, or from the concept of imperialism or colonialism. And you could make arguments certainly for the British Empire doing a lot of good stuff, and imperialism and colonialism as well having its positive side to it, in a way that you couldn't really with slavery as such. But they were putting it all into one big bucket and imagining that they're all the same thing. So that was a, and I, to the extent I could get involved in the debate, I was trying to point that out as well, that it's not right to do that. And I was involved in an online debate with the people in Edinburgh who were doing the same thing, and I did bring that up, saying like, you can't conflate imperialism and colonialism with slavery. It's, morally, these are just different questions altogether. But they've got a political agenda, not just a historical agenda. They've got a political agenda to well, what is it? It's essentially, in a way, it's just to kind of befoul the whole idea of the Union and Britain, and promote their separatism. Certainly, in my view, that's why they're doing it. But as going back to this Glasgow audit, I mean, some of the stuff in it was very interesting and raised facts that I didn't know about. But the person who wrote it, Stephen Mullen, he went along with this idea. He seemed, well, he did in the report. He accepted the forgery. I mean, in the 5 minutes that we've got left, do you want to just comment about that? Are you aware of that?
I am. Two very quick things, Alistair. You made the point about separating slavery, slave trade, and colonialism. That, if you remember the quote I read from Nelson's letter, he was very careful to say, I support our West India colonies.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't ever at any time say, I support slavery and the slave trade.
Absolutely.
William Wilberforce in Parliament wasn't trying to get the colonies abolished. He would like to see them operate through paid labour and so on, but the idea of the colonies was not something that was up for grabs. So I think they were capable of making that distinction. And you're quite right. It's wrong, I believe, in this day and age to conflate them. Can I just very quickly on that Glasgow audit, because I've got 3 or 4 very quick points I'd like to make on how you might deal with these.
Please
It was
do.
interesting that Stephen Mullen actually quoted, and if I can just quote this very quickly, I think all readers will be interested. He's talking about Nelson. He says, Nelson was, of course, a naval commander in charge of the British Navy, which included patrolling the West Indies and defending British possessions, and by extension, facilitating the continuation of chattel slavery. Now, as a matter of fact, that was wrong. Nelson was never in charge of the Navy, and by the time he was senior enough to chase Villeneuve across the Atlantic in 1805, he wasn't there long enough to patrol it and perpetuate slavery. So there are a number of factual errors that we pointed out to Dr. Mullen. And I will say he has graciously undertaken to investigate those further. But you're quite right. He was very interested in the fact that we highlighted the forgeries, and he's going to examine those.
Okay,
I think
that's good.
the interesting question, if I might, Alistair, for us, is how do we deal with these things? Because these attacks have been constant. You've got them in Glasgow. We've had them in Norwich, Nelson's home county, where people are making statements that become almost a conventional wisdom or a mantra, and they're so hard to dislodge. So I was giving some thought as to how we can address those issues. I suppose cynically, the first thing I might say is write a book. Get the line drawn in the sand. Sorry, I'll just get rid of it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, information is what it's all about.
It is. Nelson had a great saying, which was, if you want to beat them, and he was talking about the French, of course, engage the enemy more closely. And I think this is what we have to do, is to keep engagement. You can write books and articles from a distance, but it seems to me we have to be absolutely sure of our facts, make certain that we're well rehearsed, so that we can counter these spurious misquotes, if you like, such as Dr. Mullins. We need to be able to challenge those, and we should challenge them. That's the next thing. You must challenge. I think offer to meet and sit down with these people and discuss. We've done that in the case of Norwich. We'll say, we'll come and talk to you. Let's put our evidence on the table. Let's see what you've got. Because Afua Hirsch in The Guardian has never made it clear why she said what she said. We've assumed it's the letter, but we've not heard anything. The other thing which you might be interested in, I wonder whether this is something you might explore. Goldsmiths College in London bought Dartmouth Town Hall, and it had 4 statues on it, one of which was Nelson. The students said, all these statues are associated with slavery, take them down. The college decided to consult on it, and they consulted in 2 ways. One was a postal consultation of the people in the neighbourhood, the local community, 58% of whom said, no, we want the statues to stay. So tapping what you might call the unengaged or disengaged is possibly something that we ought to think about. Secondly, there was an online consultation, and 85% of the people online, possibly a broader community, possibly including some of my members, for example, strongly agreed that the statues should remain.
Yes.
So Goldsmiths have said, that's what we're going to do. And they're going to try and take forward exploring this with the local community in the future. So engagement works, and engaging them more closely is the way forward.
Oh, absolutely. And when one talks about the students at a particular university, one has to remember that you're really only talking about a tiny number of the fanatical political sociology students who run the student union. I mean, when I was at university, I was involved in politics, and the people who ran the students' union, I mean, they ran it. There was only a handful, and when I say handful, I mean less than 15, maybe 12, and they were the crackpots, basically. And this was back in the 80s, and they could release press releases, and it would sound like all the students at this university were thinking about this and believed in that, when it was really just a majority of the executive that ran the student union. So it was maybe like 7 versus 5, of the 12 who ran it, and now it's suddenly all the students at the university wanting this to happen. The fact is, most students at university are just concentrating on doing their work, and they leave the politics to the freaks, basically, in many cases. That small group of people can change and have a huge influence upon the institution, whether it's a university or whether it's councils or cities or what have you. But I think the work that you're doing is amazing, and you really are. It's groups like yourself who are at the forefront of fighting back, because it's not as if the government of the day, which in some ways is actually responsible for what's going on, but it's not as if there's all these grand institutions out there who are standing up for our British heroes. It's just small groups of people such as the Nelson Society. We here in Glasgow and in Scotland with a Force for Good and the people who support us, and other little groups like Peter Whittle's New Culture Forum, groups like that. It's just small groups like that who are doing the best that we can, as we always say, to keep the British end up. So we've come to the top of the hour, and I'm afraid we don't have any more time left, but this has been a really very interesting conversation, and I'm glad that you're fighting back. You mentioned there that some kind of book is coming together on this?
Yeah, so almost finished. It's really, I see this as being Nelson's final battle, the battle for his reputation. And what we intend to do is to publish the research that we have. It's a challenge to the historians, and to say, look, if you still believe what you've said, bring forward the evidence. We've got evidence to the contrary. Now it's up to you. So hopefully in the early part of next year, we'll be getting that out in the public domain.
Well, that would be fantastic, and we'll definitely have you back on to show that particular item of work. That's a very valuable piece of history. I'll just leave the final comment here to one of our viewers. Says, a well-trained historian. In a world of sound bites and social media where people believe what they want, we need to consider actual sources or lack of them. 100%, Paul.
Good sentiment from Paul.
Good. Okay, well, thanks very much for being on the show, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Brett of the Nelson Society. We've been putting up your website, which is nelson-society.com. I'd encourage people to go to that. It's a membership organisation. You're always organising events around about Nelson, as well as publishing an incredible. Is it a quarterly magazine?
Quarterly journal, yes.
Yeah. Well, the amount of work that goes into that, it's fantastic. It's as good as you'd get from any university. In fact, probably a lot better than you'd get from universities these days. Good.
Very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Chris. Have a lovely evening. Have a Merry Christmas and a great productive 2023.
Thank you for having me, Alison. A Merry Christmas to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Good night.
Cheers.